Hello, Captain Moran. I am literally thrilled to meet you. And I mean, everybody will know you, but you are a prize-winning columnist, an author of books that have sold millions of copies. And for me, I think you're the journalist that is closely aligned to being a therapist. Because you uncover truths and sources of shame and our toxic secrets like therapists do, and you bring them into the open so that we have more knowledge, more confidence and more joy, and a lot more laughter, which is the best therapy of all. And you're doing it for boys as well as girls. So I really am an enormous fan. And if you ever wanted to do another profession, you could definitely be a therapist.
Oh my God, this is so lovely, because most people just go, you make a lot of jokes about bums and think it's just some clowning. So I'm glad you've seen my depths and the secret mission that I'm on to. But you're totally underneath all the joking and stuff, which is there to relax people and, you know, make people sort of feel comfortable and amuse people as well, because that's part of my job. The two biggest things I always want to do is remove shame, because I was brought up with a huge amount of shame in a very shameful era, and simply being a woman is a full-time shameful job. And secondly, to be useful. And I know how useful just talking, but also culture, books, TV, films, music, because those are the only things I had when I was growing up, can be. Like, you know, a good book can change your life. A good conversation can change your life. And so I'm never not aware that at any minute in a conversation when you're writing something, you could say something that does in some way make someone's life better. So that's the loveliest introduction I've ever had. Thank you so much.
Well, it's really true, and I think the humour makes it human and palatable. So, you know, us therapists are way too serious sometimes, and I think we should make it more kind of user friendly often. And I think I think shame is probably the most toxic emotion that boys and girls have, and that if you can get to the source of it, that there's something defective about me, then you're doing an amazing job. And I guess, I have a basic question I ask all my guests, but what I want to ask as well is, given that you had the childhood that was not secure attachment and predictable, with 7 other siblings in Wolverhampton in poverty with pretty unpredictable parents, you were not formally educated. How the hell did you end up how you are? What happened that you can do it? You know, you were anxious at 16. You had this probably Roman Catholic, I guess, with an Irish dad.
Yes.
Shame, everything was evil, sex, bums, vaginas, masturbation, periods. How come you came out at 50 looking and feeling and speaking like you do?
It's weird. I went back this weekend. It was my 49th birthday on Friday, and me and 2 of my siblings managed to battle through the train strikes to go back to our old house in Wolverhampton. We hadn't been for decades. And we just had, I think as you get older, you get this weird kind of animal-like thing of every so often you want to go back to where you came from and just sort of stare at it a bit. It's not even like you have any questions. You just sort of go back and go, oh, this is where it started. Wow, okay.
But it's viscerally in you, isn't it, your home?
Yes.
It's your first home. Is like, you probably dream about it. It's like you can remember every smell, every room.
Oh, everything. And I think just the area as well, like kind of like, so we were in the Midlands, we were kind of like on the last street in Wolverhampton. So at the back, it was all fields. So at the back, we looked like we had a kind of rural upbringing, albeit this very desolate farmland with kind of pylons across it. And then at the front, it was like a classic council estate with a bus that took you uptown. And but things like the colour of the earth, I think as you get older, I'm on London clay now because I live in London. And still to me, when I'm digging in my garden, I'm like, no, this isn't proper soil. Like, it's when you go back to the Midlands, you see that red kind of sandstone-based sand. You're like, oh, that's what soil looks like. And this is what the trees looks like. And this is what the sunsets look different in the Midlands to in London. So it's that kind of your fundamental beliefs of what the world looked like. You kind of need to go back to your childhood home every so often and go, oh, yeah, this is what the world looks like, because that was the first world that you saw. So, yeah, we were wondering also how we managed, because we all got out of Wolverhampton and most of us went to university and have jobs and stuff. And we were
all 8 of you. I wondered what happened to the 7 others. Did you all kind of get out successfully? That's incredible.
Yeah, so the 2 brothers that I went back with in the end, the 2 that were willing to make the pilgrimage, one of them's now a very well-paid computer programmer. He taught himself coding. He's now married to 2 children, has a lovely house, lives just outside Brighton. And my brother Jimmy He was illiterate until 11, because I can remember teaching
Whoa.
him how to write his name in the earth outside in the garden with a stick, because we didn't have any paper in the house. And he then took himself off to education college and qualified to go to Cambridge a year early, and went to Cambridge and became the president of Footlights. And again, so that we went back to the house on Friday, and we were looking over the fence into the garden and taking pictures of it. And then we heard on the Ring doorbell someone going, "I've called the police."
Oh, God.
And we immediately had all the shame and fear that we used to when we were little kids living there, and just ran away. We just run, we've done a bad thing. And I put a note through the letterbox afterwards going, "We weren't burglars, we were just looking at our old house." And I sent them a big box of Kit Kats, because I remember when I lived there, they've got some kids there, and I was like, they'll want Kit Kats, that Kit Kats make everything better. But yeah, we were just like, how did we get out? And I think it was a combination of then. Like, I mean, I can remember in the 80s, and my parents were sort of very hard left. My dad had been a trade unionist before he became disabled. And however much they talked about how hard the Thatcher government was for the working classes at that time, it's far worse now. Because even though, you know, all the Thatcher revolution and everything that brought along with it, and how hard that was in the 80s, we lived in a council house that we paid £10 a week rent on. And all of that estate was before the right to buy. There were 3 incredibly well-stocked local libraries in our area. You could go swimming at the local swimming pool for 10p, because they would give discounts to people on benefits. It was a very well provided for town. So even if you had no money at all, something like a library, and I've written about libraries often, but like, there, particularly in a rainy northern European country, there's only usually 3 kinds of places you can be. You can be in your house, you can be in the shops and in shopping malls, or you can be in a public provision place such as a library or an art gallery or a museum. So being at home's lovely if your home is safe and you feel happy there.
Yeah, but yours was not safe.
If you don't have a happy house and you feel unsafe, you can't go there. And if you've got no money, you can't go to the shops or a shopping mall either. You can't wander around and look at stuff, because that's a place that will increasingly make you feel bad, because it's not for you. You can't partake of it. You don't have any money. So these third spaces, libraries, museums, art galleries, youth centres, family centres, they are so important if you have no other resources, because they're the one place that you feel human, and they are the places that show you ways out. And for me, that local library, every book that I read in there felt like a door that I was opening and going into a different world that was giving me different ideas. So everything
God,
that
that
I
makes
am,
me cry.
I loved that library so much. We would go there twice a day.
Twice
Everything.
a day?
Yeah, because we were always worried that someone might have brought back some books in the morning. So we'd go back in the afternoon in case there were new books in. And I read very fast. And so, yeah, everything I learned was there. And the last time I went back to that library, they gutted it. They'd taken out nearly every single book.
No.
They had one little carousel of like kind of classics, and the rest of it was like light romantic fiction or kind of Sven Hassel style war memoirs. And I love a Sven Hassel style war memoir, and I love some light romantic fiction, but all the non-fiction, all the reference books, all the classic books that were there that I read as a child, gone. And I can't think of how many kids' lives that could have been changed if they still had that kind of provision. Their lives will not change now. They have nowhere else to go. They can't be in the shops. It's unsafe to be at home. And now there's no library. Where do they go? What do they do?
They're on their phones.
Mm.
I love the idea of a book being a door that takes you into a place that you can kind of head towards.
Yes.
Do you remember a particular book that kind of pinged your mind, like, oh my God?
Oh, so many. Well, because I grew up in the 80s, and so as a girl, sort of like going into my teenage years, the 80s was very much the books that were for girls were these sort of Sweet Valley High series, which were about American girls who were blonde and skinny, who'd go to a party and get off with a boy called Brad. And on TV, it was either like hard social realism like Grange Hill, or kind of stuff like sort of Dynasty and Dallas. And for me, when I discovered books like Anne of Green Gables, which is a book about a weird, really imaginative girl, and like nothing really that dramatic happens to her, but she's trying to work her way into, she's an adopted orphan brought into a new village. So how she learns how to understand people and get on with them and make friends and work out what to wear and work out what kind of job she's going to have and how she's going to educate herself. Like, and Little Women was the same as that for me. Like, kind of, there's a particular strain of fiction written for women, by women for girls, which I think is so useful. They're about normal girls having normal problems about fitting into society and working out who they are. And then when you contrast that to the kind of books that teenage boys will be reading, which always seem to be about adventures and heists and space adventures, and I think it ill-equips boys to understand what it's like to be a normal boy trying to fit into society and work out what you're going to wear and what kind of job you're going to have, where girls are given a massive advantage because we have whole sections of libraries that are full of stories about normal girls just trying to work out who they are. And so all those books, and of course in Little Women, there was Jo March. I don't know a single female writer who doesn't idolise Jo March because she's a weird girl, but she's a determined girl.
She's
and
brave.
And when she works out that she can write and earn money, that's the only piece of information she needs to change her life. And that was the piece of information that changed my life. I was like, well, wow, you can write and people might give you money for this. I'll just copy Jo March. And that was literally.
And at 16, you wrote a novel that actually got published.
Yes. I mean, the thing is, if you're not going to school and not having any lessons, like, I think a lot of people think that if you're being home educated, like you've got a structured school day and you're being taught. A lot of parents do that. Ours didn't. We literally never had a lesson. As I say, my brother was illiterate until he was 11. So it was just down to you to get on with it. So with all that free time, writing a book was actually really easy. So you didn't have anything else to do.
But it's also like, if you think of brain as pathways that you develop by use, it's like the observations that you made and then the creativity and imagination that you let your mind go to is neither and the words to describe it is neither source of your superpower in a way.
And I feel it's a superpower that more people should have because it's such an accessible one. On World Books Day, because I remember now I'm a parent and my children go to school because I'm not a lunatic like my parents. I wanted them to socialise. And I can remember the fear of your children only tell you that World Books Day is happening the day before. And so you suddenly have to
dress them up like some Robin Hood or whatever. Yeah.
Literally. I can remember making a chitty chitty bang bang at 1 o'clock in the morning from a cardboard box. World Book Day is a kind of parents' fancy dress Olympic test. But I love the idea of it. But I was on Twitter sympathising with other parents who were on there going, oh my God, I only found out last night. And Michael Rosen, the brilliant Michael Rosen.
I love Michael Rosen. I know him, yeah.
He's a god. Came on and went, in some schools that I visited recently, rather than doing World Books Day, which particularly with the cost of living crisis, people can't afford to do basically fancy dress for a day. It was suggested that the children sit down and write their own books on that day and just write the life of their story. Just a couple of pages. And once it's an incredible technology in terms of rewiring your brain and making different synaptic connections, because particularly as a child, you tend to be told who you are all the time. Oh, you're quite lazy, or you're a high achiever.
You're the middle one, and that means you do this.
Right, or you're a Sagittarius, or like whatever it is, you're neurodivergent. And often if you're told to sit down and write a little essay about yourself, however short it is, it'll be the first time you're telling you who you are. And that's I think that's one of the big developmental markers that you can have in your life, as big as adolescents or the menarche, is the first day you go, oh, I'm going to say who I am. I'm not going to listen to other people now. I'm going to say who I am. I'm going to start explaining myself. And I strongly feel that all children should be given that opportunity because it rewires your brain in a very, very useful way.
I completely agree. And actually, it's exactly what happens in therapy. That you go to therapy and for the first time you hear yourself talking about yourself. Like, I am this, and hearing yourself say it, finding the words to describe what's been kind of messy and incoherent in your being, you discover in the same way as writing and with someone listening.
Because it's all stories, isn't it? In the end. Like,
stories.
We are all a story that we tell ourselves. And it's interesting how memory can change. Like as the years go by, you can tell yourself a story about your childhood. That's why, coming from a big family, I'm very aware of this, because over the years, many aspects of the story of our childhood, we're in our 40s and 50s. We've all got radically different views of what happened in our childhood, to the point where I've tried to encourage all my other siblings to also write books about their childhood as I have, to see how different they all are. Because I think that would be an amazing literary achievement, and also a useful thing to see how 8 people all in the same place, all the same DNA, all have such different stories. And it's not like only one of them is true and everyone else got it wrong.
They're all true.
And that presumably is a big part of therapy as well, realizing that your version of a story and your partner's version of a story, or your children's version of a story, it's not like anyone's wrong. Like,
no, you have to allow them all.
Yeah.
So the question that I always ask my guests is there a particular challenge that you are facing or have faced?
My biggest one, I think, has been with anxiety. And so we were a very anxious family. It was the 80s, so my parents very much believed that nuclear war would come at any time. A lot of people had that, but my parents really planned for it, and we would be run through drills, which was
hiding under the kitchen table, whatever.
Oh no, more proactive than that. We were going to get in our Volkswagen Caravanette and drive towards Wales, and we had like stores of food that would be bundled into the car, and my dad was convinced that he could like build us a shelter and we'd be able to glean our.
I mean, for a child, it's telling you you're constantly under threat.
Oh,
you know,
yeah.
so the threat system that this is going to happen. The child wants to feel secure and safe, and that they can breathe. And so you had this constant sort of hot shot of nuclear war that was the undercurrent as a child.
But Julia, that was a mere bagatelle compared to everything else. I mean, a lot of people had nuclear fear. On top of ours, our parents were because we were on benefits, and it was a time where people's benefits could be cut or docked. So we were constantly told that at any point someone could knock on the door and either take us into care, because often there wasn't enough food in the house, or that someone would knock on the door and go, "We're going to take your benefits away." So that was existential. And they were very distrustful. Like if the gas man came to read the meter, we were all told to hide. Like our parents didn't want us to be seen by anyone. And then there was a point when I was 13 where I chatted to a woman who lived down the road because she had some kittens and some biscuits. And as a hungry person who likes kittens, I went and talked to her. And I mentioned something during that conversation that she could have then gone to the DSS, as it was in those days, the social services, and had our benefits docked. And I was so terrified that I had given away the family secret and we might get our benefits taken away. Well, first of all, I made a pact with God. I was like, God, if you make sure that she doesn't contact the social services, then I promise I won't masturbate for the rest of my life. Because I just discovered masturbation. It was the greatest sacrifice I could think of. It's like, and it seemed to be the kind of thing that God might be into, kids not wanking. So I was like, okay. And then after 4 days, I cracked. I couldn't hold out anymore. So then I was like, okay, I've got to save the family. So like at some point before this knock on the door comes and they take our money away, I must have come up with an entirely alternate source of income so that I can go, sorry that I betrayed us to the social services, but I've got loads of money, so it's all okay. So that was when I started writing my book. And I can still remember every day, whenever there would be a knock on the door, I would run to answer the door first. I didn't know what I'd do, but I was like, if I get there first, maybe I could delay them or stop them. So I just remember that cortisol. So I look back now and I could see I was just flooded with cortisol, which rewired my brain completely. And I've got a difficult relationship with my anxiety because everyone talks about, we all know the bad side of anxiety, but it can be also used as a superpower. Yeah, because it's like it's like when the Nazis used to give their soldiers amphetamines. Like you can march for days on anxiety. Like you can fight wars on anxiety. Cortisol.
Yeah.
So I have a difficult relationship with my cortisol in that I know it's made me very ill over the years, but it's also allowed me to write, I think I'm on 10 books now in 11 years and film and TV show and columns. So the last 2 years has been a very concerted attempt to try and reduce the amount of cortisol in my body, which I think I'm doing quite well. I can't remember the last time I woke up, as I did for a good 3 decades of my life, with everything from my chin to my pelvis just
on
grinding.
Fire.
Yeah, just absolute toxic, flooding adrenaline from the moment I woke up to the moment I went to sleep. And I've made a very concerted effort to not have that anymore, which has been interesting.
I mean, it's interesting in one way that it took you 30 years, but also in another way, what was it in the last few years that you gave yourself permission to trust that maybe you're not going to go to jail, that to trust? It's about trusting, right?
I think if you come from a precarious background, if you've come from a council estate in Wolverhampton and then you're a Times columnist, you never don't think that, I mean, whenever my editor rings me up now, the first thing I always say is, are you firing me? And she'll always be like, no, I've just put you up for another award. But my first thought, every single time, it's a running joke. I'm like, oh, am I being fired? So that never goes. But I had to tackle my anxiety because my youngest daughter became very ill. She became very anxious and then depressed and then developed an eating disorder. And there was a point during her therapy process where I just had the horrible long dark night of the soul where I was like, well, where might she have picked up some anxiety? Where might that come from? I'm telling her everything's okay and she's fine and she doesn't need to be anxious. What else could I do that might help her out there?
I mean, I think you're right in the sense that those very early influences, they never truly leave us, and they always inform us because they're in us. But also that we can have a kind of moment of thought where we allow ourselves to have another thought. So rather than go straight to I'm being fired, right, you can kind of take a breath. But it sounds like, I mean, I don't think there's anything worse than seeing your own child suffer. I think that's worse than suffering yourself. Do you want to talk about that a bit? Was that the worst thing that's happened to you?
Oh yeah, I mean, obviously, yeah. There's nothing. I've done a bit of therapy here and there, and whenever, because our family, me and all my siblings, have a very robust sense of humour, and the darker the thing that happened to us, the more likely we are to make jokes about it. So the first time I went into therapy, I basically just did an hour-long stand-up routine and was kind of really annoyed that my therapist kept at the point where I'd landed a really brilliant punchline to a fabulous anecdote. I'd look up and she'd just be kind of like slightly tearful and going, that sounds really, really upsetting. I was like, no, it's funny. This is one of my funny stories from being a kid. When the dog died, it was really funny. And she was like, no, I think it was really upsetting. So watching
So you had no role model of how to feel pain, how to express sadness, or how to ask for help. You had no way of naming it, of voicing it.
And
you could
also
only just take the piss.
Yes. And when she started to get ill, I would just joke about it. And also, ours was a family, I think, that was scared of negative emotions. If people were sad or depressed or anxious. I mean, my mum's classic advice whenever any of us was suffering any terrible physical pain or mental pain would be, well, have a poo and a bath and go to bed. And sometimes that works, but, you know, it's always my first choice. But if you are, as, you know, many people in my family were, suffering from like severe diagnosable mental illnesses or endometriosis, as it turned out, or all these, you know, osteoarthritis or hypermobility, or like we've got every single affliction going, those were not the cures. So I just literally didn't know how to respond to someone being sad, unless it was, you know, I would try and jolly my child out of it. And then when that didn't work, I'd be like, well, now you just work your way out of it then. Let's bring logic and common sense. Let's research things. Would give her TED Talks. That didn't work. Then I'd get angry, like kind of like, come on, you can't, you just
life's
can't be
fine.
Yeah. It's a choice. You know, I believe I choose, probably in a way that I need to go and get some more therapy from, what my mood is generally. And it was like, why are you not making a choice?
When you're not ill, you can choose more, but when you're ill, you can't choose. Basically.
And that was the misunderstanding that I had. So it took a very long time to realise the thing that she needed me to do was to not be scared of her sadness and to just sit with her and to witness what was happening to her and go, you are sad. This is shit. I am so sorry for you. I am not scared. I'm not going anywhere. We'll get through this together. We'll get all the help you need, but we don't need to be scared of this feeling. We'll just sit with it. And at some point you will feel better. But until then, I'm just here with you. That took about 4 years to figure that one out, which is a burning shame to me, because had I known, I would have done that from day one. But that was the biggest learning curve of my life, was finally, sitting with someone who was sad. And I'm a fixer and a doer, and to not be able to fix it and to realise the way that you did fix it was to sit with the sadness was contrary to everything I'd ever believed before.
But it does feel like a kind of paradox, isn't it? That by being with her and witnessing and listening and being alongside her and not trying to poke her to change was actually, but loving her as she was in her. I mean, I imagine she was extremely difficult, probably extremely complicated, you know, hard to be with. You know, you can hate your children as much as you love them. And that's really hard as well, because then you feel kind of bad. But it's recognizing that being with is actually more powerful than any kind of fixing or doing is even now, I don't think it's generally recognised.
Well, that was why in the end, when she got better, she said, I want you to write about my illness. And just because the information isn't there. I mean, as soon as she got ill, I was like, I will read everything, I will do everything, and we'll have fixed this within 2 to 3 weeks tops. And then the first thing they tell you with an eating disorder is this will be between 5 and 7 years, probably. And so I was like, well, I reckon we can at least half that. I will apply myself. And I just read everything, but like to find someone explaining what is happening to your daughter, that it's not something you can parent your way out of. Previously, a child not eating is ostensibly, if you had to categorize it bluntly, naughty behavior or incorrect behavior or, damaging behavior.
Sort of sit here until you finish it or eat it for lunch when you
exactly.
have lunch.
you put some kind of discipline to it, or you put some kind of incentive to it. You treat them for doing it, reward them for doing it, or kind of discipline them. You can't be a parent with a child with an eating disorder. You have to become a mental health professional, and it's a completely different mindset to be in. And I'm aware of how this problem has got even bigger since my daughter was ill 5 years ago. I literally do not know a family with teenage girls in it at the moment who don't have a child who is either depressed, anxious, has an eating disorder, is self-harming. I literally don't know of a family that doesn't have at least one girl who's and the stats we can see are rising all the time. Something was it 2/3 now of teenage girls said they're not happy with themselves at all, and it was a 10th.
They
back
got
in
much
the
worse
70s.
in lockdown. Yeah.
And it's like it's an existential crisis. Like, girls don't know how to be happy, and I think a lot of that responsibility for that. I mean, there's many things, the economy. I think it's hard to have happy, optimistic children when you're told that the world is ending and you're never going to own a house or be able to afford to have kids.
And also the eco grief and all the climate and all that.
Is that you're just not hearing birds singing in the morning, like kind of that's they don't even know how depressing it is that they don't hear that. But I think also feminism. I'm write a lot about feminism now. I'm a feminist. Women are very good, and it has been necessary for grown women to explain all the things that are difficult about being a woman. The physical stuff, being a mother, giving birth, dealing with sexual harassment, trying to find your way through politics, all this kind of stuff. But I've also become aware that children are listening, and that we're not making being a grown woman seem like a job they'd want to apply for. Like, we don't concentrate on the joy and the power and the connectivity of becoming an adult woman. And I've really tried to, the next couple of projects that I'm working on, and I've always tried to, I always make sure I only write about something when I've got a solution and some joy at the end of it.
Yeah.
But as grown women, I think we need to be really aware that little girls are listening to what we're saying. And if we're always talking about how dreadful everything is, we can't be that surprised when a lot of them go, well, I think I might just stop eating and not become a grown woman. Like, I see why they're doing that. To me, that seems like a sensible opt-out. Like, I will delay becoming an adult. I will stop eating. I'll stay a child forever.
Because in fact, children learn from how you behave and what you do, and not from what you say.
Oh, yeah.
So if you're constantly saying to your children, be happy, but you're not happy, if you're constantly saying to your children, eat up, but actually you've got a really weird relationship with food, your behaviour is what is the most powerful influence. So if your children see you having fun, going out with your girlfriends, having a laugh, getting pissed off and having a bad day, but also having fun, then that's the model they learn from.
And this was, I think, the biggest revelation I ever had as a parent. And sadly, it came at pretty much the end of parenthood by the time they were in their late teens. But it was, I'd thought, which is very much my father's parenting model, that being a parent was a series of wise speeches that you would come and deliver like a preacher man. You'd come in the room and go, kids, I'm going to explain something to you about politics or the environment or medieval history, whatever it is. And you will sit and listen to this, and I will convey my wisdoms, and I will enjoy talking, and you will enjoy listening, and that is how I'm doing my parenting. Here are my wisdoms. And they got to their late teens, and I realised they'd never listened to any of it. There's nothing a child is less likely to absorb than a big, portentous speech that a parent thinks is important. And 98% of parenting is they're just watching you.
Yeah.
And they're learning how to
talk. And listening.
Yep, they're learning. When I realised it the first time that I was upstairs in my office and I had some friends coming round, and my oldest daughter opened the door and she immediately greeted them as I would and was like, how was your journey? Come and sit down. Do you want a drink? Do you want to go straight to the beer, or do you want to have a tea first? Do you want to go in the garden? Literally me. And I was like, oh, I've taught her how to open a door. She never listened to any of the speeches about medieval history, but she knows how to welcome some people into the house. And suddenly it was like, oh, right, that was the parenting I was doing all along. The bits that I wasn't paying any attention to, that's what they're paying attention to.
I'm also interested in, I think I've read that you had a difficult relationship with your mum. I'd love to know a bit more about that. But how come you didn't repeat? Because most of us repeat unintentionally which you said you repeated some of it. But you have now a much closer relationship with your daughters. Tell me a bit about your mum and how then you've done it differently.
She wasn't
Irish.
No. So she was from a middle class background. Her mum was a teacher, and she went to the Perth School for Girls for a couple of terms, I think. And then she became a hippie and dropped out and met my dad. He was like a working class kind of rock star at the time. And she was very, they had a very passionate relationship, very much fell in love with each other. And they wanted to live the hippie ideal in Wolverhampton. Hard to reconcile these two lifestyles. Wolverhampton's not a welcoming place for people from the alternative culture. We were definitely the only hippies in Wolverhampton. And her big thing we worked out later, although it should have been obvious at the time, is she liked babies. She liked children up until the age of 2. She liked being a mother.
To a new baby.
Yeah. And then once they got to 2, she would get pregnant again. And then that child, I was the oldest, would become my responsibility. So it was kind of like, you can talk now, you can argue back. I've got a new cute one that can't talk on the way. So you're now done. Like, I'm going to pass you over to the rest of the kids to be raised. So we were called Kids Gang, imaginatively. And I came up with a whole religion for us. I was the one in charge of them. I can remember I had this big...
So you learned to mother by mothering as a child, right?
Yes. And of course I felt really grown up at the time. But like kind of when my daughter hit 13 and I was remembering, oh, you were given... And my mum was really ill after our 5th kid. And so that girl... I looked after from day one because my mother was bedbound, and I would sit her I'd fold up a towel, put it on the draining board, sit her on it, and I would be talking to her while I peeled potatoes. We ate vast amounts of potatoes every day. So I could not only peel, it probably would have been 20 pounds of potatoes whilst looking after a toddler, but I'd also worked out that you could put a book behind the taps and the taps would keep the book open. So I could also read and talk to the kid and peel potatoes at the same time. I was like really multitasking there. And
quite
so, yeah,
cortisol fired.
Oh, yeah, very. But I loved the feeling of capability. I didn't enjoy being a child. I wanted to be an adult straight away. And the way...
Because you weren't safe as a child. You needed to be an adult. I mean, in the trade, it's called you're a parentified child.
Oh, go on, what's
Have you heard that?
No.
Was that you were a child who was forced to be a parent when you were a child?
Oh, yeah, that's me. Yeah, that's definitely me. But I liked that.
But can you play as a child now? Because you have a lot of playful child in you. The way you write, take the piss. It's like a 6-year-old, right?
Oh, playing, that's how I always describe it. I mean, to me, writing is playing. And when we're with friends, the kind of conversations we have are very playful and silly. And even when I was a teenager and I started going out... Poo-based, did you say?
Yes.
Poo-based. Oh, poo-based. Oh, God, yeah. I mean, there's so much poo-based stuff, definitely. Whenever I interview someone on stage, one of the questions is, have you ever pooed in a cup or a bag? And it's surprising how many people have pooed in one or the other, definitely. It's quite a revealing question. But yeah, no, play is my fun. But verbal play is the main thing, because that was the thing we had as children. Like, we had literally no resources. Like, I know is my idea of still the working classes, I think, are better at that than the middle classes, because all we've got is words. The only present you can give someone is a joke or a beautiful sentence. And the only way you have any power is with a devastating sentence or an angry sentence or a clever sentence. It's the only resource you have. It's the only thing you can stockpile and
That's
hoard.
free.
They are the most precious things, words. And so I used to have a list of all my favourite words. Whenever I'd come across a great word, I'd write it down on my wall. We were allowed to draw on the wall, and I'd have like cathedral, uxorious, collodial, mercury, chagrin, like all my favourite words just written down on the wall. I'd be like, let's see if I can use that in a sentence today.
How did you enable yourself to parent differently, given all that?
Oh yeah, there was a question, yes. Sorry, I'm bad at that. I'll go off on a diversion.
It's a good one.
I don't remember there was a question. I just knew I wanted to do everything differently to my mother.
That was like your default.
Yeah. Whatever she did, I'll do it differently. Like, I want to be around.
Yeah.
The main thing I wanted them was to not feel shame or guilt. Like, in our family, if you made a mistake, if you did something wrong, it would still be referred to 3 years later. Like, kind of, I once lost a library book. Awful. I lost the Gibbons stamp collecting guide that we got from the library. And I lost that. And my parents called me Katie Cockup, because they used to call me Katie, for like 4 years after that. And it burnt me. So one of the first things was like, as soon as the kids have made a mistake, as soon as they've apologised, that's it. We'll just never mention it again. I used to have a feeling whenever I left the room when my parents were in it that, like, obviously they never did this. I'm about to say that I felt like a knife would be thrown across the room and would land between my shoulder blades as I left a room that my parents were in. They never threw knives. I was never stabbed in the back. It was not that kind of family. But that would be the feeling I would get. I would have this itchy feeling between my shoulder blades that as soon as I left the room, they'd be like discussing everything that I'd done wrong. And I couldn't bear that. So we were like, but me and my husband are very similar. We were like, We want them to just feel that they're great. We want to just, as soon as they apologise, it's gone. They're not carrying this weight of who they were even yesterday around them. Every day is new. We always presume the best in them. We just wanted to make them polite, merry, brilliant conversationalists who could look people in the eye and feel confident in doing that. And anything after that would be down to them to show us who they were. But that was all we wanted them to do, to be able to look someone in the eye and confidently talk to them and feel happy in who they were. And I'm going to praise myself for 30 seconds. We've definitely done that. They're amazing women. They're amazing young women.
That's incredible. That is incredible.
Thanks,
Julia. Is that... I mean, I really do think, because I was talking about our children yesterday, my husband, like if, when they were young, and we had lots of difficult times with them, very similar difficult times with one of them to you. And if I'd been told then how they are now, I'd have said, okay, I'll take all of this, with all the worry that they're not going to be okay is the thing. But now I look at them now, I mean, they're older than yours. I'm just like so relieved more than anything else, and proud.
It's really hard because I think essentially who they are when they're about 9 or 10 is who they come back round to at 20. But then the teenage years are this massive voyage into them trying out loads of different iterations of themselves. And there's a certain point where they seem to often turn into the exact opposite of what they were when they were 10 and what they will be again when they're 20. And you've just got to hold your nerve and go, they're just trying this out for a bit. Like, you don't need to overreact. Like, kind of, it's just a little experiment. But of course, you don't know that at the time. You're like, this is the first step towards chaos and despair. And you're kind of in overdrive. Whereas, the one thing I'd do differently, again, is just have a bit more confidence it was going to be okay. That, like, two girls that come from a house that is so full of love and conversation that it is, you don't need to constantly be going, this is the beginning of the end. They are going to be fine. Like, it's fine.
Yeah, and they are. That's an amazing thing. Should we talk about boys? Your wonderful book, What About Men, is coming out in paperback now or soon.
Yes. Where is it? 1st of June, I think. Yes.
I've read it cover to cover. I read it in literally one sitting. You write so well. It's like talking to you. It's like you're in my head. I love it.
Thank you. My biggest aim is that it just be readable, because like it's the first draft I wrote had all the facts and figures in there. It was much more a piece of journalism, and it had everything in there that I wanted to say, but it was just not that.
But not you.
Readable.
You're
and
in
chatty.
it now.
Yeah, and like you need to go out and talk to people, and you need anecdotes. It needs to be visual. It should be chatty. It should be easy to read. I don't believe that self-improvement or learning something should be anything other than a joy. If the author's willing to put the effort into it. Like, that's the hard bit, is to make something that's, hopefully smart and useful, also just fun to read.
You describe at the beginning your refusal to talk about men, like men are men's problems. You're a feminist. You're going to answer questions about women, about girls, about everything to do with feminism. And then we don't need to talk about the sort of moment that you changed your mind. But tell me what it is now that you want people to understand about men.
It's so women and girls, having been a girl, having come from a family that was dominated by girls, having 2 daughters, being surrounded by women, I was, and it's still my greatest obsession is just trying to understand what a woman is, how we got to this idea of it, how it changes, the unique things that we have to overcome, how brilliant we are. Just women are my thing. So when I kept being told, yeah, it's great that you're doing all this feminism stuff and women, but what about men? I'd be like, yeah, you know what? They're fine. They are fine. I've got uppermost in my head a whole bunch of facts on sexual assault, harassment, rape, the pay gap, the emotional load, how motherhood disadvantages you, just all this stuff. And then I know all of my history and how very, very recently it is that women have been treated as human beings rather than chattels. So I feel men are fine. And I think people are becoming more aware of it now. If you just read the news, like particularly over the last, sort of 5 to 10 years, it's becoming increasingly obvious that we've taken our eye off the ball for boys. And you just look at it, there's a whole bunch of very dolorous sort of stats at the beginning. So boys are more likely to be excluded from school for bad behaviour. They're more likely to be put on medication for that bad behaviour. They're less likely to go on to further education. They're more likely to become addicted to drugs, alcohol or pornography. They're more likely to be involved in violent crime. They're more likely to be attacked by other men. They make it the majority of the homeless population, the majority of the prison population. The leading cause of death for men under the age of 50 is suicide. And 1 in 4 men over the age of 50 said they had no close personal friends. And so when you look at that, that's a bunch of like...
It's a shudderingly awful set of stats, isn't it?
Right. And
terrifying.
there doesn't seem to be any joined up thinking, in the same way that the feminist movement has been so good at looking at all the problems of women and girls and going, we will form a women's movement. Like, we will talk about these things. We will see how they're all interconnected. We'll start talking about a combination of legislation for how to change things and culturally how to change things. But the main thing is that women and girls are very good at being honest about their problems, talking to other women and girls about them and coming up with solutions. We don't see shame, particularly in the last 10 years. It's been this high watermark for women just not giving a shit about being able to confess.
A lot of it helped by you, I've got to say. You've been a leading light in that.
Thank you. I am this country's leading shameless woman. But that's been really noticeable. Like, there is no subject that you can't find a stand-up comedian or a writer or a filmmaker or a pop star talking about, and in a really joyful, brilliant way that allows immediately the next day 2 13-year-old girls on a bus to be able to talk about this stuff, and suddenly you've given them a template for a conversation and a tone which is shameless and joyful and constructive, and let's change it. That tone is not there for boys and men. And the big cultural difference that I seem to be the sort of the example of this is in men's and women's toilets. If you're a girl in a nightclub and you have a bad night, you go into the girls' toilets and immediately there'll be someone offering you a safety pin to mend your dress, someone else offering you some deodorant or lipstick, someone putting their arm around you going, he sounds like a bad guy, you shouldn't go back with him. And you leave the toilet with your arm around 2 girls going, hey, I've made some new friends.
Yeah.
My understanding is that doesn't happen in the men's toilets. There isn't that thing of, if you get some boys together within 2 minutes, depending on their age, they'll be talking about girlfriends or things with their bodies or parenthood or aging. They just don't have those kind of conversations about their problems. And so that's the underlying problem, I think, that informs everything else. This very key thing, which apparently starts happening around the age of 5 or 6, that before then, all the people I've spoken to are like, boys and girls are roughly similar. Boys in school will hold each other's hands, they'll kiss each other and tell each other they love each other. Around about the age of 6, suddenly they become aware of gender. And it's like, no, that's a girl's thing, or, oh, you're gay. And suddenly there's a whole bunch of things that boys suddenly can't do anymore. And a key one of those is going, I'm scared, I'm anxious, I'm depressed. All that's left is being kind of quite cocky. We've seen little 6-year-old boys being cocky or quite angry, but you're not allowed to be sad anymore. You're not allowed to be fearful or anxious or whimsical or vulnerable. And so that's what informs everything else that you see from then on. I think every other problem that you see from that point is that women have this massive technological advantage now, that we are unashamed to identify a problem in our lives and then get together to solve it. And boys and men and the culture at the moment don't have that. And the only people who are talking about the anxieties and problems and vulnerabilities of men and boys are people on the extreme right. Misogynists like Andrew Tate. Yeah. Him being the exemplar. But there's a whole world of that. There's an amazing book by Laura Bates called Men Who Hate Women, which just looks in how big that subculture is. Like, there are dozens of Facebook groups that have over 300,000 members with very radicalized, hard right, misogynist men and boys who basically blame all their problems on women. And I think that's a problem of the progressive left, because they left it to the right. They left a void there for people like Andrew Tate to be the only people going, hey, let's talk about men and boys. Every woman with the same kind of platform that I've got spends half their time being an unpaid feminist. We're constantly tweeting out petitions and talking about things and mentoring young girls and talking about being a woman or a girl. My male peers from the same kind of political background don't do that because that culture isn't there. And so we've dropped a whole generation of boys who have grown up not knowing the history of women and how recently we were oppressed and didn't have the vote and all these things. All they know is that in all of their lifetime, it's all been about feminism. There's been feminism clubs at school. We've got Beyonce, people walking around going, this is a feminist t-shirts, books called things like 100 Kick-Ass Women from History, and feminist mums saying things like, typical men, typical straight white men, in a jokey way. But if your feminist parents have been like putting all this attention into their teenage girls, which we understand why, and I've been part of that, and you've forgotten that you've got a 15-year-old boy in the house who's just hearing you jokingly going, typical men, like, you know what men are like, and not ever going, are there specific problems to you? What are you equally scared and anxious and vulnerable about as your sister? Not only are they not getting that support in the house from their parents, but there isn't anything culturally. There's no kind of, progressive men's clubs for them to talk about these problems. They can't go and watch the male equivalent of Fleabag or the male equivalent of Girls or a male equivalent of Beyonce who will give them these kind of encouragements and conversations to start. So there's a void. It's kind of our fault. And so the book was, I was like, we need to start redressing this. We've got to admit that there's a problem here because we can see it. And the latest statistic was there's now a 30% gap in the political beliefs between young men and young women under the age of 25 now. Women are becoming increasingly left-wing and progressive, and young men are becoming increasingly right-wing and conservative. So they will be likely to say things like, feminism has gone too far. It's easier to be a woman than a man now. They're the ones that want to row back on abortion rights. And a 30% gap for people under the age of 25. We've never had that in society before. The idea that the same generation is so different depending where they are in the gender.
So people listening, I mean, a lot of people that listen to my podcast are women and young women. I guess we need to be listening to boys. I mean, I think what you're saying is the quality of connection and the quality of the conversation and the openness and the vulnerability that women have, that we have this depth of connection, we have friendship, we tell each other stuff, we're not armoured, we don't pretend everything's okay, so we don't kind of squash it down so that we can deal with things. And also we have the confidence now of feminism. And that boys are shutting down, and in shutting down they either hit out or they really suffer. And so as women, we want a role model like my brother, come and talk to me, or come for a walk with me.
Well, my first thing is always, because I was careful to try and make it not look like this is another problem for women to solve, because we get dumped with everything. I didn't want it to be like, hey, women, we've improved our lives.
We're doing the emotional load here too.
Exactly. Yeah. Now we've got to go and fix the boys. So I'm like, okay, what's in this for women? And what's in it for women? Because I had quite a few feminists going, oh no, have you gone over to the other side? Have you abandoned women and girls, and now you're saying it's all about boys now? Absolutely not. I'm team tits till I die. But if you talk to any woman or girl, 50% of our problems are men. It's unhappy men, it's angry men, it's men who believe that you've got an advantage, it's men that are harassing you, it's unkind men, it's men who aren't taking their share of the emotional, physical load in families. So you can't fix the girls until you fix the boys. So that's what's in it for us. We will have happier lives if men are happier. And we need to find a way to empower them to have these conversations. It's not about power. I just want to make men jealous of feminism, basically. That's what I've tried to do in this book. I've tried to go, look, if you think it is genuinely easier to be a woman than a man now, then there's only one material advantage we have. Men still own 99% of the world's wealth. They're still sort of like dominant in everything, business, tech, politics. The one thing women have got that you haven't got, the one thing that might have given us an advantage that you're jealous of, is feminism. We created this thing that allows us to talk about our problems and find community and fix them. So have a bang on this, have a bit of feminism. Come on, come and steal our thing. We made this thing, come and share it with us.
I mean, what you also say is that 90% of men are okay, and it's the 10% that cause real trouble. But then of the 90%, a lot of them are, particularly the younger generation, are very distressed and anxious and disempowered. So you're wanting them to kind of go, okay, I'm going to have some of what they're having, like when Harry met Sally.
Yes, that's my hope. I mean, I don't know, 90% is based on the men that I know and love. I don't want to be any more dolorous than to think that it's 10% of men that are causing the problems. But it's not just causing the problems for women, it's causing them for men as well. The kind of 90% of good men who are just kind of, patriarchy screwing them over as much as it's screwing over women, because it's those 10% of loud, bantery, aggressive, angry, radicalized men who are making nice gentlemen's lives difficult as well. They're the ones who you're sitting with in the pub who will start some kind of fight or start harassing a girl, and you're a nice man sitting there going, I don't know how to stop this. I don't want this to happen, but where would I be taught how to stop someone that I'm sitting around a pub table with who's drunk going over and like trying to touch a woman on the other table? Like, we've not even got that far. And particularly if you're a teenage boy with some older boys, how do you remove yourself from that kind of toxic behavior? Like, just by sitting there, you're implicated in it. And these are kind of anxieties and stresses that build up in you. And like, I dislike the fact that the majority of men are being disadvantaged by this small amount of outlying, usually damaged men. From talking to people who work in education, they were saying, for instance, in the chapter about pornography, when we're talking about, as parents, I think we think maybe we do talk about pornography when they go to secondary school or in their teenage years. But the reality is kids are watching this stuff at like 10, 9, 8. And your child's entry into the world of very violent and horrible online hardcore pornography is predicated on the most advanced kid in their class going up to them with a mobile phone and going, look at this. Isn't this horrible? Isn't this weird? And for talking to teachers, a lot of teachers after this book came out, they were saying, yeah, the kid that usually is the first one to go and show all the other kids porn usually comes from an abusive family. There's usually sexual abuse within that family. They've been sexualized very early. To them, it's not weird that they're looking at pornography. And then they are the outliers that then bring it back to a class and show it to everyone. So again, the fact that there's no big studies done on this stuff, that a very small amount of kids from damaged backgrounds are then changing the climate so that we now have the world where 90% of teenagers are getting their first sexual education from watching violent, extreme, unpleasurable pornography. And we're not really working out why that happened or what the long-term damage is to both boys and girls that they're watching this stuff. Just seems crazy to me, because if this was happening to girls,
makes no sense.
There would have been feminist organisations all over this
all
10 years
over
ago, right?
What have boys said to you, men and boys said to you in response to your book?
It's been absolutely mind-blowing. It's been really, really interesting. Like, kind of, the first one was that a lot of them just thought that it was going to be an angry book in which they were going to be blamed for stuff. I think particularly young men are so used to women being angry at them. Like,
it's kind and loving, your book. It's compassionate and funny.
I don't want anyone to feel anything, again, I'm allergic to shame. But they were just, even when my daughters read it, they will jokingly go, oh man, typical men. And after they'd both read it, they were like, you know what, even though I've been saying it in a jokey way, I'm going to stop saying that now, because like I can see boys have difficult lives. Yeah, it's mean. And what big advantage does a 14-year-old boy have over a 14-year-old girl in this day and age? They're not really. I mean, it's 30% more upper body strength, like kind of, but socially, sexually, economically, kind of like, we're pretty much even pegging now. I was really moved by, there's one chapter's about how common it is that we will take the piss out of men for having midlife crises. The kind of man who goes off and gets a tattoo or a motorbike or, kind of like...
menopause. Yeah.
Yes. And that's risible in popular culture. If you want 10 minutes of easy, cheap laughs, you can just take the piss out of a middle-aged man doing these teenage things. But then I just dislike that kind of bullying. So I was like, let's have a look at this. And if you go and look at men who are having the kind of typical midlife crisis where they relive their teenage years, what you usually find is that they didn't have their teenage years when they should have had their teenage years. That all too often they were carers for parents. That they were so busy building up a business or in education that they didn't have the motorbikes and the tattoos, or that they were very fat, or that they thought they were very ugly, or they were very spotty. So they were just kind of, shy and at home, and certainly not getting a motorbike and a tattoo and working out at a gym. So to paraphrase Eric Morecambe, they're having all the right life events, but not necessarily in the right order. And there's no shame in having your teenage years when you get to 50, if that's the first chance you've had to have it. And I just don't like the fact that as long as you're not hurting anybody, and also when women get to their midlife crisis, then it's like, oh, she's Shirley Valentine. She's off shagging someone and she's got a new dress and she's working out and like, she's having a great time. We celebrate women for having like a teenage rebellion and focusing on themselves in their midlife. But as soon as a man does it, it's seen as sad. It's like, if we're even picking on men who are just getting a tattoo, like you can start to see why you start to get men who are really resentful and like, well, everything we do is a joke. We're just always the sitcom dads that everyone's taking the piss out of. There's no kind of, nowhere are we allowed dignity or celebration for being a man. And I became very aware of the fact that we really do not celebrate masculinity. We're scared of it. It's all about girls now. So every broadsheet newspaper will do 50 young women to look out for, the 100 most influential women in the country. We would never do one just on young men.
You were one.
Yes, I've been one. I think I was the 14th most influential person in this country in 2012, but my powers have waned since then.
I don't think so. But I think the difference between teasing and mockery is that teasing is done with warmth and affection and sort of kindness. It's like, I know you, I know this bit about you, and I kind of love it, and it's funny.
Yes.
Whereas mockery is contempt.
Yes.
And contempt is very akin to shame. Contempt is toxic. And if you think all emotions are transmitted, we are transmitting contempt, and then we expect people to turn around, young men, to be nice to us.
Totally. And like, to talk in very broad generalizations, if we do believe that men find it slightly harder to process their emotions than women because there isn't that framework and that structure and that vocabulary and that culture that women have now, to then additionally be treating them with more contempt than we are women.
It's a vicious circle.
Yeah, like, and you can totally see why now. The stats are just ticking up so fast on young men who feel really they want a different kind of culture. And what the only solution they're being given is that it become a more conservative, that we go backwards, that you go back to a time when men earned the money and women stayed at home and looked after the children around the house. Because the only people who are saying to them, if you feel insecure in the 21st century, are those kind of regressive conservatives who are saying that the biggest malaise that men suffer at the moment is you used to have power. Men used to be the most powerful people, and you've lost that. So the only way you're ever going to feel better about all your problems is if we go back to a time when you had power over someone, women. Then that makes a really, to me, fundamental mistake, because power over someone doesn't solve your problems. It's something very similar. It's empowerment. Learning to understand your problems, learning to self-soothe, learning to improve your environment, learning to make yourself feel happy about yourself. You know, if men are struggling to go into higher education, how can they be empowered to feel they can go into higher education, rather than, as is being sort of proffered to them, being told if you had power again over women and women couldn't go on to university, then you'd feel fine. Like, why? Like, the message in feminism has always been, well, women can be better, and that's how we'll get empowerment. Someone has to lose in order for you to be able to feel that you've got to win. Whereas feminism was never about that. I don't know any feminist, however hardcore, that's gone, the solution is that we need to have power over men and they need to have lesser lives in order for us to be greater. Feminism has always been about, let's make the pie bigger. Let's give everyone pie. Let's give everyone empowerment, which again is the thing that I'm trying to say in the book. Like, kind of, boys, there's a second option. We can make the pie bigger. You can feel just as empowered as women. You just need to learn to talk about your problems and maybe experiment with wearing different trousers. I think modern men's trousers are
Too tight.
Too tight. They look like tights, literally like they're wearing medieval hose.
Yeah.
It's too tight.
So listen, I want to get back to you because we're coming to the end. And as I was listening to you and remembering you saying your greatest challenge is anxiety, and hearing you speak about your children, but also young men and what you believe, you sound so unbelievably confident. It would be impossible to believe, well, it's hard to believe that you feel anxiety. Tell me the bit that I'm not seeing.
Ooh. Oh. I mean, I've learned to not go on social media anymore, really. I'm very aware of good housekeeping for your brain. If you even go and look at the negativity for 30 seconds, I can remember 10, 15 years ago when I had my first Twitter storm and everyone was being really horrible to me. The actor Chris Addison from The Thick of It, who's a friend, rang me up and went, I'm just going to take a guess now. Are you like out with your kids teaching them to learn how to ride bikes, but actually you're having an argument in your head with someone who said something nasty to you on Twitter 2 weeks ago? And I was like, back of the net, absolutely. I have been arguing with that guy for 2 weeks to prove him wrong. He's like, it's good housekeeping. Like, your head is your house. You would never allow someone in who was standing on the doorstep shouting abuse at your letterbox. And that's what social media is. Like, you just don't go and look at it. It's not brave. It's not part of modern life. You don't need to go out there and know what people are saying. Like, what other people's opinions are none of your business, as RuPaul says. So I'm very strict about trying to keep my head only full of positive things, because I will dwell otherwise. How do I stop anxiety? I'm very aware of the physical link between anxiety. So,
more exercise, or you do?
Yes,
yoga?
I do an hour of yoga every morning and physiotherapy for various things. I go for at least an hour's dog walk a day. I've got a garden. The big thing has been my garden, because I
saw your article about our garden was wonderful therapy.
Huge, because I think, especially with the eco grief and this feeling of the world being out of control, and going back to my childhood, like, how the world's going to end and like you've just got to be ready to die. And for a very long time I was like, oh yeah, we're living through a terrible time and we're losing things, and all I can do is be angry about it and sign some petitions. And it's suddenly that thing of realizing you just got to keep your side of the street clean. Like, if I make my garden a place that wildlife will want to come to, like, I can't do anything about whales in the North Atlantic realistically, but I could read what habitat will make birds that will bring me dawn chorus, and that will make me happier, and it means some birds will live. And I've done that. I've built a pond, I planted all the plants that birds love, and I now have goldfinches and wrens and blackcaps and woodpeckers. I'm in the middle of London. I've got newts, I've got frogs, I've got a toad, and just that it's such a cumulative thing, because you feel like you've got power and you've made things better and it's treating you, but you're also looking after all these other things as well, which appeals to the mothery, power crazed part of me. I'm like, I've made life. I'm looking after these guys, but they're looking after me. So it's a really good circle. So if anybody, even if it's like a window box, like kind of anything that allows you to feel that you've helped something that's helping you. I've got my windowsill now in my office. I put dried worms out there every morning, and I'll just be sitting here typing, and I'll just see a little blue tit sitting outside, and I'm like, enjoy your worms, mate. And I like to think the blue tit goes,
but it gives
"Thanks
you
very much."
oxytocin, right? So it's the opposite of cortisol. It
Yeah.
gives you a little burst of feel good.
Which is what I used to get off social media when someone was going, ha ha ha, good joke. But like, there's no chance that the next message I will get will be someone just going, you should die in a bin fire. Like, kind of, I think, and I recently, all my kids have got diagnosed with ADHD, so I presume I've got it as well. It makes sense for how I am. And like the kind of serotonin and oxytocin bursts that I used to be seeking by going on social media, I've now replaced that with same little burst, a real Twitter, the Twitter of birds. Twittering on my and it's the same thing, so it's the same chemical thing, but in a way that I've got control of, and that can only be good. So a tiny bit of control can often solve the problem, I have found.
I think what I've learned from you is that the lessons you learned from your childhood were that you needed to use words, but actually the thing you really learned was I wanted you use words to change how people feel about themselves, because I felt so shit. I felt so shamed, anxious, and attacked. I never want anyone to feel that ever again. So I'm going to use those words to give people the words that they can hold on to as confidence, as information, as power, as empowerment, so that they can have a better life.
I've read so much about neuroplasticity, and I'm just obsessed that, like, I think we can still dismiss, again, especially in an era where we're closing down libraries, we just dismiss the power of words and books, but like, and just like, oh, it's just a book and you read it for enjoyment or whatever. It's like, no, there are parts of my brain that physically exist because of certain books or even certain sentences. That's such a sexy, brilliant, wizardy power to have if you are intent on using it for good. The idea that I meet girls and women who go, your book literally saved my life. Your book literally changed how I think about myself.
I can see how it would.
And that the idea that you can go in and just, I remember when my daughter was ill, just thinking, the part of your brain that's making you ill now is probably the size of a grain of sand. If I could just get my finger into your brain and just change that one grain of sand and replace it with something else, you'd be rebooted and you'd be fine. And the joy of not even the joy, the drive of writing is going, I could write things that would replace the bad grain of sand with a good grain of sand. I don't think there's any better game to be playing than that, because writing is fun anyway, and you get to make all the same jokes and all the same thrills at the same time. But if at the end of it, you've just replaced one tiny bit of someone's brain, and for the rest of their lives, they've got this new good wiring that's going to see them through, that is so unbelievably, I mean, all the hairs have gone up on my arm.
I can feel it too.
It's all I want to do. It's all I want to do, because I've been that girl with that bad grain of sand, and I read the book and it made me better. And like, I think authors are often recruitment agents for other potential writers. I'm really sure that all the writers I was reading knew that there would be some girls reading their books who would then want to become writers. It's like a good version of drug dealers. We give everyone the first tip for free, and that's like, come on, you could be a writer too. Come and join in this game. So that's what I always, with my writing, and my biggest thrill is when I meet boys and girls who go, lots of books that I've read I loved, but I didn't understand how they wrote those books. But when I read your book, I felt I could write one. And I try really purposely to write in a way that makes people think, oh, I could write, or I could tell my story, or I could copy the way that you thought there and have new thoughts of my own. But it's a kind of open access programming where you go, I could play that game too. I want everyone to come and play with me in a lovely world of fun.
I think what a wonderful place to end. Thank you so much, Caitlin Moran. That is a wonderful conversation.
Oh, it's been amazing. Is there anything you can diagnose me with? Can I get my free bit at the end? The bit of me that's my dad is like, where's the free bit at the end? Diagnose me with something.
My free bit at the end would be to give yourself time off from doing it so that you can reboot. The propulsion to have to do something all of the time is exciting and amazing, but is also demanding.
Mm.
And so I don't know within you, I mean, you've got your habits of walking and yoga, but actually, I don't know if you ever have a day that you don't write, for instance.
I'm so scared what will happen if I'm not busy. I think I would get sad. So I just keep going. So that's, yeah. So, but you know, I enjoy my job, so it's good. So I'll never need to find out what it's like if I stop working, because I have a very big mortgage and I enjoy my job.
Okay, let's finish on there.
Thank you for my diagnosis. Thank you.
Hello, Emily and Sophie. We are going to talk about the Caitlin Moran episode, and I mean, it's a great episode. She's amazing. I wondered what stood out for you two.
Well, first of all, I have a massive girl crush on Caitlin Moran.
Yeah.
I've always loved reading her columns, and I read More Than a Woman when I had a newborn and I was stuck in New York during COVID, like in proper lockdown with a tiny newborn. And I just remember sort of lying in bed, sort of breastfeeding while reading my Kindle, and sort of like viscerally, like I felt like, oh, she's speaking to me, just to me. She's not talking to anybody else, just to me. I think that was sort of such a huge part of her message, was like the power of words and the power of books that sort of allow you to feel like, oh, like you've put into words my experience in a way that I can't put into my experience, but when I see it written down here, then I completely connect it. So I'm sort of very grateful to her as a sort of super fan.
Yeah.
I'm cheering alongside you, definitely. And her first book, How to Be a Woman, was one of those books you pick up and go, you've just yes, and you. So and she was so compelling in the interview, and there were lots of things that I wanted to talk about. And I'm sitting here thinking, I don't know which one to start with.
I mean, I think that's what she's like, that she fires one up. Before I spoke to her, I'd read her books again and listened to her. And so there was so much I wanted to kind of get from her. And there's something about capacity to find the exact word that connects with each of us, it connects with us universally, that is an extraordinary superpower.
And obviously her new book is about men, and I have to say, like, my initial reaction was like, oh, men, just like sort yourselves out. And I think it was partly informed by, like, I have had this week where my husband's away, I've got 2 small children, we've got a dog here, and I was like, oh, like it did feel a bit like, oh, you're adding another thing to the things. But I think that really misses this idea of a dialogue, that you need to be able to have conversations, and a lot of men's experiences of feeling disempowered, even if in most ways they actually have more power, though I know there's lots of statistics about homelessness and prisons. And then I think of
mental health
issues, and I think of my son and what I'd want for him, and I'd want for him to be able to cry and talk about things, which I sort of think society is generally moving in that direction. But it does it feels quite complicated. It feels hard to sort of, yes, I'm going to be like a cheerleader for men, even though I completely agree that it's not about like the size of the pie being anyone else getting less. But there is a sort of internal resistance, I think. So when you start talking about empowering men, I'm like,
they're empowered already.
Yes, but I agree with her, and like there is a bit of me that's like,
true.
Oh, yeah,
that's so interesting. I can really understand that response. It wasn't my response. My response was like, yes, please. Please give me men in my life who are good at talking to each other and know how to talk about their feelings. Because as she described, and certainly at least from my own experience, a lot of my emotional education, as well as from my family, was from my friendships and how to talk about things and emotions and dramas and processing that with your friends. In a way that,
and laughing about it,
yeah,
like laughing about all the things that are like horrible and hard, like periods and sex and
shameful, and your families, and making sense of your family. And there you are. Then if you are heterosexual and you end up in a relationship with a man who then hasn't learned, hasn't been taught, hadn't been modeled how to do those things, and yet you and them are supposed to have a lifelong if you decided to commit to monogamously relationship. And yet there's this like emotional deficit of emotional intelligence and skill for the majority of men. And that is such a hard work thing often for the female partner in that regard, if that is the dynamic between the two of you, because then you're often having the one that raises the conversation or navigates the emotional conversation or encourages the therapy and says it's okay to cry. And so I think it would be fabulous for men, because I think how great for them to know how to manage their own suffering in a way that doesn't harm other people. So much of the prison population or domestic violence is driven by men who are very complicated, very wounded, and no support since a child to really know how to do it in a way that doesn't hurt other people. So I'm all for this.
Well, you see, I'm all for it.
I know you are.
But I think the thing of like sort of having to galvanize men to do it for themselves. It's not like that.
Like she said at the end.
Agree. The end result would be incredible. And I think it was very interesting what she said about the sort of role models, like male role models versus female role models. And I know she sort of talked in other interviews about like Adrian Mole essentially being like the only sort of normal boy role model, and that's been around for a long time. And I do think it would be good to have like there's a sort of few sort of cartoony ones. I think like the Diary of a Wimpy Kid. He's quite like a sort of anti-hero that little kids love.
Dickens.
No, I was talking a bit more contemporary.
Well, you're talking about books as well.
Yes, but I was sort of talking about things that like teenage boys would be able to relate to, or like like boys that are 7, 8, 9, to sort of recognise themselves in them. They're probably not going to read Dickens. I also thought that I don't think there's obviously a progressive equivalent of Andrew Tate, but there is this quite interesting man called Richard Reeves, and he's the president of the American Institute of Boys and Men, and their website is a really good place to go if you're sort of interested in any of this research and the sort of thinking around society at the moment and why men are struggling in the way that they are. And there's lots of different articles on there from different psychologists and sociologists. And I think it's just, if you just go to the American Institute of Boys and Men. And I think that the fact that her book came out, and this institute only was founded last year, so very sort of current.
Yes, and Esther Perel is starting to talk about men as well, isn't she? That's a new thing that she's...
Men are having a moment.
They're having a moment. The other thing I was interested in when she was talking about very sort of courageously about being a mother to a daughter with an eating disorder, and I was thinking about, you said, Mum, about hating your own children, and which made me chuckle to myself. But when I was listening,
I knew it was going to come up when I was listening to the podcast today, and I thought, oh God, I forgot that they were going to be listening to that.
And I think we'd all be aware that at some point we've hurt you and hurt Dad and made you have those sorts of...
And vice versa.
And I'm not saying vice versa, but I guess it's a more common narrative, hating your parents. It's less of a common narrative of what it's like. And I just wanted to... My children are still too young to have anything more than, for me, feeling anything more than like rage bursts in a moment where I can't get them to do something or when I couldn't breastfeed. I'd be interested in you saying a bit more about hating your children and what that's like. And
yeah, why do you hate us, Mum?
No, I don't mean it in the long term.
I know.
But like, how do you manage it? What do you do with it? How do you what do you do? It's hard to hate your own children, but I would imagine almost every parent has.
Yeah, I'm sure.
So, I think it's taboo to hate your children, and I recognise that there were times. I think if you're kind of looking at it from a step back, is where you love most, you hate most, because you have your strongest feelings. And when I've hated you most is when in some ways you frightened me most, where I felt most worried, most powerless, but also that I failed most. So it's somehow when you're suffering, when you've been suffering, and all of you have in different ways, and I am not able to be the mother that can in some way support you or change what's going on, there's a kind of rage in me that I hate you because I'm hurting, because you're hurting. And I don't want to feel like I hate you, because that obviously isn't what you kind of identify as being a loving, good mother. But it is what I felt. And
is it also
what I showed, I think, as well. I mean, we had big
and
fights.
said, I
And
said,
Yes.
on both sides,
No, but it's not what a mother normally says to a child.
No,
right?
I imagine most parents have said that to their children. But I also sort of wondered if it's all of those things, and there might be certain things that your child does that presses a button in you that's not really even about them, that it presses on something for whatever reason, that like either it's a sort of projection or it goes to something in your own childhood experience, almost it's sort of a reenactment or replay of something that's really to do with you and it's not really to do with them, but it's very deep and very like it's so sort of primal that it's quite then hard to sort of separate or really recognize that actually the reason I'm having such a big reaction to this is only partly because of what my child is doing. It's also partly because of my experience of being abandoned or my fear or when I got hurt or like whatever it is. But sometimes it can help to just sort of slow, when you have a very big reaction to your child and you feel like you hate your child, I think exactly what you say. And I think it can be helpful to stop and think about what it sort of means for you as well, like separate to them.
As a therapist of 33 years, I had not thought of that about myself. But as you're saying it, of course you're right.
No, I wasn't saying about you. I was, of course, not saying about you. I was saying
of course
in
you're
general.
Right about me.
In general.
Well, of course. I mean, I literally. It's so funny that I can see things in other people that I am completely blind to in myself. I mean, it's funny, and of course, it's common.
Yes.
But actually, until I heard you say it, the hating of you, I thought was because you hurt me, because, or not you particularly, any one of my children.
Quick, not you.
But what I hadn't acknowledged or examined or looked at was, of course, it was also hitting the child in me that hated my own parents for not looking after me or abandoning me or not protecting me or all the different things that parents fail in. And I hadn't realised until this minute. At 64.
Yes, like I'm sure you would like have the same, right? Like you always have blind spots about yourself.
I do remember someone actually saying that to me. I'm part of a women's group, and I'd been ranting about my husband and being like, sometimes I just hate him. And then after sort of a while, one of the other women were like, it was interesting listening to a podcast that's called This Jungian Life about hate and how the sources I hate are more often like basically something to do with you. There's something that you feel that you have to, that particularly hate, not just like anger, but like that kind of extreme that comes from something like, no fucking way am I going to go there.
I remember, I don't know how old you were, Safe, but you were not very old. You were a teenager. You saying to me, you were the adult, and you said to me, Mum, I don't think you can say that. You have to take that back. And I this is in the kitchen. And I was in the kitchen and I said, I am not taking it back. I am furious. And you were kind of looking up at me, this teenage child, saying, Mum, can you be the grown-up? Yeah. And I was like, no, I can't be the grown-up. And I'm right.
I also remember, though, with great satisfaction, and still, as I did at the time, age about 7 or 8, stamping up the stairs. And every time I slammed my foot down, I shouted, I hate you, with each foot. I hate you, I hate you, I hate you. All the way up to my bedroom.
I remember that too.
All these things to look forward to, so my children don't say hate you yet, but they do say, Mama, I'll put you in the bin. Put you in the bin.
Yeah.
Get put in the bin a lot. The other thing that it really made me think about was shame, and her sort of huge sense of shame about everything as a child, and her sort of the family culture of shame. And now she writes about all the things that other people might feel shame about, and it made me think sometimes a way of fighting the thing that we find the hardest is to go like completely to the opposite extreme. Like, I'm not only am I not going to feel shame about this, I'm also going to write about it for millions of people to read about my own personal experience of it. So like completely turn my insides out as a way of saying like, no, I refuse to feel this, and I also refuse to let other people feel this sense of shame. And it made me think of there's a DBT, which is dialectical behavioral therapy skill, called opposite action, which is essentially where you go towards the opposite of your emotion. So it's not about ignoring or disregarding your feelings, but it's sort of about taking control of your emotions, essentially. So like if you feel shame and your urge, like the action that you want to do is to hide, acting opposite to that emotion, sort of holding your head high, kind of going out into the world. Sometimes, and doing it fully. It doesn't work if you sort of half-assed do it. You have to like really fully do it. It can be really experienced as very empowering, about sort of like, I am not beholden to my emotions. I recognize them, I validate them, but they're not necessarily going to be in control of me.
That's nice.
It's very empowering. It's like you're going to be a standard bearer for what would normally shoot you down. You're going to go, no, I'm not. I'm going to fight that.
Yeah. And you don't need to write books to do it. You can do it in really small ways.
One other thing I thought I wanted to talk about, and we've talked about it here before, but this sort of astronomical rise in mental health issues in children. And she was talking about eating disorders as maybe a way of children not wanting to grow up into a world that feels very scary, and there's lots of fear, and there's so many things. She talked about modelling being a woman and talking too much about the negative side of being a woman, perhaps without the counter of the joy. And I've thought quite a lot about with my own children, particularly around climate anxiety, because it's something I care about and think about a lot, but also about what and when do you want to let your children know about the dark side of the world, the scary stuff about the world, like what's preparation and what is too much too soon, and
like the nuclear threat that was too much.
Exactly like that. And I think one of the things that I've come to the conclusion of is, and people might have very different views about this, but I basically think you spend most of your life exposed to the difficulties and the scary stuff in the world, and that the longer you can protect your children and have them to have a sense of bodily safety, feeling safe in their bodies, is a really great thing. If you are able to offer your children that, it's a privilege, and lots of people don't have that privilege of being able to protect their children from what's scary in the world. Taking joy in the world is one of the most powerful things you can do to counter fear. So for me, around eco-anxiety, which is something I do feel, it feels like it sounds small, but actually taking massive joy in the rest of nature, I think, is one of the most radical ways you can respond.
It's the antidote.
Not just to my emotional, psychological health, but for a sort of systemic level, like not living in that state of fear that does so much damage. We act from that place, it does damage.
No, I agree. And I think there's a difficult balance that everybody's trying to walk between being honest but also sort of not wanting to freak your children out. But I do think it's possible to do both. Is to be honest if your children ask you questions, but do it in a way that doesn't make the world feel like this terrifying place. And I think doing exactly what you were talking about, Sophie, which is such a beautiful image. Like I sort of have a picture of you and your girls like prancing in the garden.
So do I.
Just really sweet.
I don't know why we have that. It's because you do it. It's what you damn do.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that you can do is focus on, particularly if you have a child that is more prone to anxiety, that does worry about things, gets caught in their mind, is look at the things that people are doing. So like find the things that people are doing in the world, whether that's however small, but they're also really big things that people are doing across the globe to help, and sort of focusing on the helpers as well as the sort of reality of this is a big problem. And I think it is possible to do both.
Yeah, and the perfect way to end. So thank you, Caitlin Moran, for your originality and brilliance and for being on our podcast. and Soph and Emily for all of your insights and feedback for me. Always a joy. Thank you. I hate you. And thank you to everyone that's listening and has become really important to us, those that listen to the podcast. Do please share this episode with anyone you think that would enjoy it. Do please rate and subscribe. And until next time, thank you.